Beamy Seth, 28, work as a research assistant at an analytics firm downtown. The job is exactly what it sounds like. You read reports, pull data, organize findings into something other people can present to rooms full of people who don't read reports. Been there a few years? It's fine. Quiet work, decent pay, nothing that's going to end up in a documentary. The main skill the job requires is sitting with a large amount of information and finding the actual structure underneath it. You strip out the noise, find the pattern, describe what's actually there rather than what someone hoped was there. Turns out that skill becomes relevant to this story. I have a friend named Reese. We've known each other since we were around 20. He's a photographer, commercial work mostly, but he does personal projects too. He goes to gallery openings and art events for professional reasons, networking, being seen, whatever photographers do at those things. For some reason, he always drags me along. His theory is that I make him look more serious and considered. My actual contribution to these events is to stand there holding a drink and occasionally nodding at something on the wall. I don't know anything about visual art, and I've never pretended otherwise. But Reese says I have a face that looks like I'm thinking deep thoughts. Usually I'm just trying to remember if I left anything on at home. It was at one of these gallery things that I met Cleo. She's a curator at a natural history museum in the city. That means she manages exhibitions, handles collections, works with donors, writes the text you read on the plaques next to the objects. She's been doing it for a few years, and she is clearly good at it. When I first met her, she was standing near one of the installations talking to someone, explaining something about the artist's choices, confident and specific, clearly actually engaged with the subject rather than just performing engagement for the room. A lot of people at these events are performing engagement. She wasn't. I ended up in the conversation somehow. We talked for a while, exchanged numbers, got coffee a few days after. First coffee turned into dinner, turned into a second dinner, and somewhere in there we were seeing each other. The first few months were good. She'd tell me about whatever exhibition she was working on, the logistical headaches, the interesting objects, the funding politics that went on behind the clean white walls. I'd tell her about whatever research project I was in the middle of. We had enough overlapping taste in things, books mostly, some films, a certain kind of dry humor, to keep early conversations easy and interesting. She was opinionated, and I genuinely liked that. I'm not great at small talk, so someone who shows up with actual positions on things is a relief to me. She had views on everything, and she stated them clearly, and she knew a lot. I found that attractive. She was also good company outside of conversations, easy to be around, the kind of person who makes a Saturday morning feel useful without making it feel scheduled. We'd go to markets, look at things, get coffee, wander. She knew the city well, and she had opinions about which neighborhoods were worth knowing and which places were worth going back to. For a few months, it genuinely felt like one of those situations where you think, okay, this works. This is something. I want to be accurate about this because I'm not telling this story to make her into a villain. She had a lot going for her. The first indication that something was off came gradually enough that I didn't name it for a while. I just started noticing. After a lot of our conversations, I felt a low-level friction I couldn't locate, like a sound just outside the range of hearing. I'd sit with it afterward and try to identify what specifically was bothering me, and I couldn't always find it. Eventually, I identified the pattern. Whenever I described a situation, any situation at all, work, something that happened during the day, something I'd read, whatever, she would explain to me what it actually meant. Not what I thought it meant. What it actually meant, delivered in this patient, certain tone. The tone of someone explaining something to a person who just needs a bit more context before they'll understand. My coworker being difficult to work with became my coworker navigating a male-dominated professional environment. My frustration at a project that wasn't coming together became a thing about how men in research carry structural advantages they don't account for. A film I mentioned enjoying became a discussion about what my enjoyment revealed about my underlying assumptions. A book I was reading became an opportunity to talk about whose perspectives were centered in that kind of writing and whose weren't. A disagreement I'd had with someone at work became, before I'd even finished describing it, a story about power dynamics rather than a story about two people disagreeing about a method. I want to be clear that I'm not dismissing the existence of any of those things automatically. Those conversations can be real and worth having, but it happened with everything. There was no version of any story I told where the first response was just, that sounds frustrating. Are you doing okay? It was always immediately sorted into a framework, always relocated into a larger structure, always a lesson to be received rather than a thing to just sit with for a moment. And there was something else underneath it that took me even longer to name. I was never the one who had a point. I could describe a situation, and she could describe the same situation, and somehow her version was always the structural truth, and mine was always the thing that needed to be corrected. Not in an aggressive way. She was never rude about it exactly. It was patient, almost kind, the way you'd be patient with someone who was almost there but not quite. The cumulative effect of that over months is something you can't really describe in a single moment. I started adjusting my behavior around it, not consciously at first. I just noticed I was sitting on something I'd normally mention because I was doing the calculation in my head without realizing I was doing it. Is this worth starting? Because if I start this, the evening shifts into a long discussion, and I end up having done more work to be heard than I actually got back in return. And the conversation always came out the same way, with me understanding something about my position and her feeling like she'd helped me get there. I told myself every couple has a thing. Some couples fight about money or practical arrangements or family. Ours was ideological discussions. That's not the worst thing in the world, I reasoned, kept adjusting, kept editing myself a little more each time without quite noticing the accumulation. I'd done something at work I was actually proud of, and I caught myself thinking about whether to bring it up. Not because I thought she wouldn't be interested, because I knew within about a minute it would become a structural conversation instead of me just telling her about something I was pleased about. So I mentioned it briefly and moved on. That's a small thing on its own, but when you're doing it with everything, it adds up to something larger than any individual moment. Reese came over for dinner at some point, all three of us. He'd met Cleo a few times before, and he's always polite, makes an effort, he's good with people. At some point during the meal, she went to the bathroom. Reese looked at me and said something like, "Does she always explain you to yourself like that?" I said she just had strong opinions. He gave me the look. Reese has a specific look for when he thinks I'm wrong, but he's decided not to push it. It involves a slight pause, and then a very neutral expression that somehow conveys everything. I've known him long enough that I can read it clearly. I told him it was fine. He said okay. For the record, he was right, and I was wrong. I didn't know that yet. The evening with the list happened a couple of weeks after that dinner. We were at her place. I'd been there for the evening. We'd eaten. We were talking. I mentioned I was tired, not fishing for sympathy, not trying to start something, just as information, because it was true. It had been a dense stretch at work, and I was running a bit low. She said something about how I didn't really understand what genuine professional pressure felt like. She brought up the specific challenges women face in curatorial roles, the additional scrutiny, the need to perform and justify in ways men in equivalent positions generally don't have to. She said my tiredness was a kind of baseline tiredness, and I should probably try to keep that in perspective. I sat with that. I didn't argue back. Arguing back is not my instinct, but being told that my tiredness didn't count landed differently that evening. Maybe I just had less buffer than usual. Maybe it was the accumulation of a lot of smaller moments over months, all hitting at once. I don't know exactly. I just know it was different. After dinner, she got up, went to her bag in the other room, came back with a folded piece of paper. Handwritten, neat, 9 book titles with the author listed underneath each one. She put it on the table between us. She said she had been trying to explain certain things to me for months and was tired of working that hard at it. She said these books would give me the foundation I was clearly missing. That until I had that foundation, we were using completely different definitions for the same words. That this was making real conversation between us impossible. She said it the way you'd describe a practical solution to a practical problem. Calm, almost businesslike, like she was handing me the assembly instructions for something. I looked at the list. I looked at her. She said once I'd done the reading, we'd actually be able to talk. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. Said okay. She seemed satisfied with that. I don't think she expected resistance, but I also don't think she expected quite that level of calm. I went home, put the list on my kitchen table, made tea, looked at it for a while. 9 books. I'd heard of some of them in passing, had a vague second-hand awareness of what a few of them argued, but I hadn't read any of them properly. Here's the thing about giving a reading list to someone who does research for a living. I read things carefully. When I want to understand something, I find the actual source, and I work through it properly. I don't skim. I don't read summaries. I don't form a view based on someone else's description of the argument. I find the text, and I sit with it. So my reaction to a reading list was not resistance. It wasn't reluctant compliance either. It was just, here is a thing to read. I will read it. The next day, I made a tracker. A simple document. The 9 titles, columns for main arguments, key frameworks, notable passages, places where the argument seemed rigorous, and places where it seemed to extend past its evidence. That sounds clinical, but that's genuinely how I absorb information. I need somewhere to put things as I encounter them, or I lose the texture of what I've read. I started the first book that week and worked through the list steadily over the following few weeks. Read in the mornings before work, on lunch breaks, in the evenings after dinner. It's not like I was racing through them. I was reading properly. Cleo saw the stack on my desk when she came over and seemed genuinely pleased about it. There was something in her expression I registered and set aside. It looked like relief, like a problem being resolved. I didn't think much about it at the time. I was just reading. The books were more varied than I'd expected. Some were theoretical, building conceptual frameworks for thinking about how power structures operate in everyday life. Some were more empirical, drawing on studies and data about how labor and opportunity actually distribute between people. Some were more personal, memoir-adjacent accounts meant to illustrate broader patterns through specific experience. I read all of them with the same kind of attention I'd give a research source at work, tracking the actual argument, what evidence it relied on, where it was rigorous, and where it was selecting past what the evidence supported. Reading them as a set was interesting because you could see how they built on each other and also where they diverged. Some of them agreed on the core observation, but disagreed significantly on the mechanism or the implication. I noted those disagreements because that's what you do when you're reading seriously. I agreed with a lot of it, genuinely. The research on the invisible distribution of domestic and organizational labor was solid and well evidenced. The concept of the mental load, the ongoing invisible work of planning and maintaining a shared situation, was a real phenomenon backed by real data. I read those sections and recognized something in them in the practical sense. Not performing understanding, but actually seeing something described that I had experienced. I also noticed where some of the broader arguments were generalizing past what the evidence could actually support, where certain things were being stated as universal that seemed more contextual. I kept those observations to myself and kept reading. There wasn't anyone to share them with anyway, and I wasn't looking for an argument. I was still just reading. What started happening around the fourth or fifth book was something I wasn't quite doing deliberately. I'd be reading a section describing a pattern, and I'd find my mind running through our relationship looking for that pattern. Not as an exercise, not intentionally, just a kind of background processing running alongside the reading. Who planned our evenings when we did things together? Who remembered the practical details of things we'd talked about needing to do? Who had picked things up for both of us without making it into an announcement? Who had consistently cooked when we were at my place? Who had adjusted their communication style to keep friction low? Who had been doing the invisible ongoing work of keeping things running smoothly? Who had done the work of managing the emotional temperature of the relationship? Who had been the one to smooth things over after difficult conversations, and who had been the one those conversations were usually aimed at? The answers came up consistent. They were not ambiguous. I wasn't upset reading this. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was more like something that had been slightly blurry for a long time, finally coming into proper focus. I kept reading. By the time I finished the 9th book, I had about 40 pages of notes. Frameworks, specific arguments, passages I'd flagged, places where different books connected or contradicted each other. I also had a fairly clear picture of what our relationship actually looked like. It was different from the picture I'd been operating with. Not dramatically different, just clearer, more accurate. The first time I used any of the vocabulary from the list was an ordinary evening a week or so after I finished. Cleo had come over, I'd cooked, which was the usual arrangement when we were at my place. After dinner, she was on her phone on the couch, and I was cleaning up. I said, while rinsing a pan, that I'd been reading about the mental load concept, the invisible ongoing work of planning and maintaining a shared situation. The research showing that whoever carries that disproportionately accumulates a specific kind of chronic background stress. I said it neutrally, just as a thing I'd been reading about and thinking about. Then I asked, genuinely, which of us she thought was carrying more of that load in our relationship. She put her phone down. There was a pause. She said that was a different context. I asked what context the research was designed for then. She said I was being reductive. I said I was asking a specific question based on a concept from the reading list she had given me. She said the books weren't meant to be used like that. I asked how they were meant to be used. She didn't answer that directly. Talked about the bigger structural picture I was missing. I said, okay, what was the structural picture? She went back to her phone. The conversation ended there. But something had shifted in the room, and I could feel it. She didn't seem angry exactly. She seemed unsettled, like she'd been expecting the question to land differently. I kept drying dishes and didn't say anything else about it. I added a note to my phone that evening. Just what had happened, roughly when. It felt like a researcher's instinct, more than anything deliberate. I'd been keeping notes since I started reading the list, connecting ideas between books, tracking where the frameworks mapped onto observable things. This was just extending that habit into the relationship itself. A week or so after the dishes conversation, she canceled on me. We had plans she had actually suggested, going to see a photography exhibition that Reese had told us both about. I'd been looking forward to it, the kind of afternoon that felt easy and low pressure. I was already on the train, maybe 15 or 20 minutes out when my phone buzzed. She wasn't coming. She was tired. Sorry. No further detail. I turned around and went home. I wasn't furious. I was flat. Flat is different from furious. Flat is what happens when something confirms a pattern you've been trying not to name. I didn't make anything of it that evening. I made something to eat and watched something on my laptop and went to bed. Just sat with the flatness. The next day, I brought it up. I said clearly that if I had canceled on her the way she'd just canceled on me, she would have made it a significant thing about how I didn't value her time. She said I was comparing incomparable situations. I mentioned a section in one of the books on her list that I had bookmarked, a passage about how double standards and communication expectations are the everyday mechanism through which inequality in a relationship gets maintained. That holding different people to different norms in how they're required to communicate is not a small or incidental thing. It is actually the structure. I said I was applying what I'd read. She said I was doing it deliberately to provoke her. I said I had done what she asked, read the material carefully, and this was me engaging with it. She said that wasn't what she'd meant by engaging with it. I asked what she'd meant then. She said engaging meant using the ideas to grow, not to compete. I said I wasn't competing with anyone. I was describing a situation using the framework she'd provided and asking a genuine question about it. She said I had a deeply defensive reflex and was incapable of receiving feedback without immediately reversing it. I said I had spent the better part of 8 months not pushing back on things, that now I was engaging with her own framework and pointing out where it applied to her. That was being called a defensive reflex. She said this was exactly the problem with how I'd approach the reading. I said I was uncertain what the correct approach looked like if applying the ideas was automatically wrong whenever they applied to her. She said she was too tired for this conversation. Left. I added to my notes. A couple of weeks after that, there was the dinner at her place with 2 of her colleagues from the museum. I'd met them both before at various things. We'd talked. It had always been fine. Cleo cooked. We ate. Conversation moved around naturally. I was talking about a project I'd been working on. It involved municipal archival data from different periods that used incompatible recording standards. An interesting methodological problem about how you reconcile sources that were built on different assumptions. I was maybe halfway through explaining what made it complicated, what made it genuinely interesting as a problem. Cleo started talking. She didn't do it aggressively or obviously. She picked up what I was in the middle of saying, translated it into her own phrasing, added her interpretation of what I was working on. And the conversation continued from her version. Her friends engaged with her version. I sat there, finished my drink, waited. A couple of minutes later, there was a natural lull. I said something like, I've been reading a book from Cleo's list that describes a specific pattern, where one person cuts across another mid-sentence and reformulates what they were saying in their own framing. The book had specific terminology for it. I said I was curious what the equivalent term was when it went in the other direction. The table got quiet. One of her friends looked at Cleo. The other one looked at me. Cleo said it was a completely different situation. I said I understood she thought so, and I was asking her to explain the distinction, because the way the book described the pattern seemed general rather than directional. She said she would explain it later. Later never happened. After her friends left, she was cold for the rest of the evening and didn't want to talk about it. I didn't apologize because I'd asked a question during a conversation, and I thought that was within reasonable bounds. She said I had embarrassed her in front of her colleagues on purpose. I said I had asked a question that she had been welcome to answer. She said I knew perfectly well why she couldn't answer it. I said if I'd been sure I knew the answer, I wouldn't have needed to ask. We went around that circle for a while. Eventually, she said I was fundamentally incapable of receiving feedback without deflecting. I said I hadn't deflected anything. I had applied a concept from her reading list to something that had just happened in real time in front of everyone. She said the framework wasn't designed as a reversible tool. I said I genuinely didn't understand how a useful framework could only be valid in one direction. She said she was too tired and went to bed. I went home. It kept going like this. Not every evening, there were ordinary ones in between. But these collisions had a rhythm now. I recognized the rhythm. A few weeks after the dinner, there was an evening at her place where she was talking about work stress, something significant coming up at the museum, complications with a major donor, a colleague who wasn't delivering on their part of the project and making everything harder. She talked for a long time, and she was good at laying it out. I could follow all of it clearly. I listened carefully, asked follow-up questions, stayed in it with her. There was a natural pause eventually. I mentioned I'd had a difficult stretch at work too, a particular project going sideways in a way I hadn't anticipated. She said I always said things were fine, though. I said the reason I said things were fine was that every time I'd actually started to describe something going on for me, the conversation had shifted back to her experience. So I had stopped starting those sentences a long time ago. She said that wasn't true. I said I wasn't accusing her. I was just telling her what I'd observed happening over time in our conversations. She said keeping score wasn't the same as being in a relationship. I said I wasn't keeping score. I was describing a pattern. And there was a meaningful difference between those two things. I said if describing a pattern equaled keeping score, then every single book on her reading list was keeping score, because they all describe patterns, and that was their entire method. She said I was being deliberately obtuse. I said I was trying to be precise. She went back to talking about the colleague. I listened for another 20 minutes. She wound down eventually, and the evening got quiet. I stayed a while longer, then went home. I didn't bring my project up again that evening. By this point, I had moved from phone notes to an actual notebook. More space, clearer to organize, easier to look back at. Dates, what had happened, what was said, the dynamic around it. I wasn't planning to do anything specific with it at that point. It was just how I worked. You track things, you keep records. You don't rely on memory for things that matter, because memory is unreliable and selective. The notebook was getting full. There is something clarifying about writing things down in that way. It takes the ambient noise of a situation and gives it a shape. I'd been doing it for weeks, and the shape was becoming very clear. Cleo's friends contacted me around this time. Separately, not together, which suggested coordination. One of them had what was presented as a casual check-in that felt like it had a different purpose underneath it. Asking general questions about how things were between us, in a carefully neutral way that was doing quite a lot of work. The other was more direct, and said Cleo felt like I was weaponizing feminist theory to win arguments. I sat with that phrase for a while. Weaponizing feminist theory. I'd been given a reading list and told explicitly that without doing the reading we had no common language and couldn't have a real conversation. I had done the reading. I had engaged with the arguments carefully and seriously. The arguments applied to observable things in our relationship. I had raised those observations using the vocabulary the books had given me. At exactly which step in that sequence had I done something wrong? I genuinely could not find it. The evening her friends came over happened maybe 2 weeks after those conversations. Framed casually, they were in the area. They thought they'd stop by. Fine by me. We sat in the living room, some small talk, and then one of them got into it. Said she'd heard something about what was going on between Cleo and me, and she was concerned I was engaging with these ideas in a fundamentally adversarial way. That feminist theory wasn't a debate toolkit. It was a lens for understanding structural dynamics. The other one nodded along. Cleo was watching from the chair across the room. I got up, went to my desk, got the notebook, came back, and sat down. I said I preferred working with specific things. So, let's be specific. I opened the notebook. Over the previous couple of months, I had cooked at my apartment around 23 times. Cleo had cooked at her place when I was there roughly 4 times. She had canceled plans without advance notice or any explanation 6 times. I had canceled once, with advance notice and a full explanation and an apology. She had talked across me mid-sentence in group settings on at least 3 occasions I had noted clearly enough to write down. Twice she had paraphrased something I said in a way that shifted what I'd meant, and conversations had continued from her version without anyone returning to mine. Once, at an event at her museum with her professional colleagues, she had introduced me to someone with something about how I was still working my way towards certain ideas. Said in a warm tone, like she was being fond and indulgent, but said to a room full of her peers. I read through the list, closed the notebook, set it on the table. I said, using the vocabulary and the framework from the reading list she had given me, if I had done any one of those things to Cleo, what would it be called? Nobody said anything. One of her friends was looking at Cleo. The other one was looking at the notebook on the table. Cleo said I was doing this to win. I said I wasn't trying to win anything. I said I had been given a set of tools, and I had used them, and the picture they produced was not the one anyone had expected. I said that was not my fault. She said the framework wasn't designed for this. I asked again what it was designed for. Structural and systemic inequality, she said. I said the notebook wasn't a philosophical argument. It was a list of specific things that had happened between 2 specific people in a specific apartment over a specific period of time. If the framework could identify dynamics at a structural level, it could identify them at the level of 2 people in a room. One of her friends said I was clearly intelligent, but I was weaponizing that intelligence. I said I was asking questions that the books themselves raised, that if the answers were uncomfortable, that seemed worth sitting with rather than dismissing. Cleo said what I was doing was exactly the behavior the reading list had been meant to address, that I was exhibiting the classic defensive pattern of a man whose sense of control was being challenged. She said it with real conviction, like she had been waiting to say it. I said I had made dinner 23 times. One of her friends laughed, short and involuntary, and immediately looked at the floor. The other one kept looking at Cleo. Cleo stood up. Her friend stood up. She said I needed to think seriously about what kind of person I wanted to be and what I was actually trying to do here. They left. I sat in my living room for a long time after that, not angry, not particularly sad, calm in the specific way that happens when something complicated finally resolves into something simple, like when a data set that looked messy and noisy turns out to have a clean structure once you strip out the irrelevant variables. I got a glass of water, sat back down, looked at the notebook still on the table, put it in my desk drawer. I'd liked Cleo. I want to be clear about that. I still liked her in some sense. I'm not telling this story because I hated her or because I wanted her to look bad. But in that moment, I was very clear about what had been happening for months, and I was equally clear that it was not going to change. She texted that evening asking to talk. I said to come over whenever she was ready. She came 2 days later. She started by saying she thought I had fundamentally misunderstood the whole purpose of the reading list, that the point was empathy, not analysis, that she had wanted me to come back with a softer understanding of certain experiences, and instead I had come back with a research document. I said I understood that was what she'd hoped for. I said the problem was that the books themselves weren't soft. They were rigorous, analytical, built on evidence and structured argument. I'd engaged with them the way they were written. She said I was emotionally avoidant. I said I had cooked for her around 23 times, listened to hours of her professional frustration, and kept most of my own frustrations quiet because the space to express them hadn't reliably been there. She said I kept bringing up the 23 times. I said I kept bringing it up because it was directly relevant to the conversation we were having, and nobody had actually engaged with it. She said feelings weren't a spreadsheet. I said I agreed with that. And I said feelings existed inside a context made up of actual events, and those events were what I was describing. She went quiet. Then she said she felt like I had turned something she'd done in good faith into a trap. I said I hadn't set a trap. I had done exactly what she'd asked. The problem was, it had shown me something she hadn't expected me to see. She had given me tools to understand a relationship, and I had used them, and they had described our relationship accurately. Not the version she thought we were in, but the version we were actually in. She said that was a cold way to describe 8 months together. I said I wasn't trying to be cold. I was being accurate. Being warm about something that wasn't working didn't make it work better. She asked what I wanted. I thought about it for a moment. I said I had wanted a relationship where two people talked to each other without one of them carrying a reading list for the other, where someone could mention they were tired without being told their tiredness wasn't structurally significant, where one person's stories weren't reformulated in the other person's framework before they were allowed to count, where someone asking a genuine question wasn't described as exhibiting a defensive pattern, and where the work of making things run was shared and not invisible in only one direction. She said she hadn't done any of that intentionally. I said I knew that. I said intention didn't change the pattern. She sat with that for a while, then said maybe they needed some time. I said that was probably right. She started gathering her things from around my apartment. I helped her find what she couldn't find. A book on my shelf, a jacket from my closet, a few other things. She stood at the door for a moment before leaving. Said she had genuinely thought the list would help. I said I thought it had helped, just not in the direction she'd planned. She looked at me for a second. I don't know what she was looking for. Nodded. Left. No raised voices. No drama. Just the quiet sound of someone leaving and then the door closing. I stood in the hallway for a moment, then went and sat back on the couch. The apartment felt the same but also different in that way it does when something has just changed. I texted Reese. He came over the next morning. We made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and talked. He asked how I was doing. I said fine, which was true in the real sense, not the deflecting sense. He said he'd figured something like this was coming. I asked how long he'd figured that. He said since the dinner, where she explained me to myself in front of him. I said I wished he'd pushed harder on it at the time. He said I wouldn't have listened. He was right about that, too. He looked at the bookshelf. The stack had been visible on my desk for weeks, and now it was gone. Asked where they went, told him they were in a box. He asked if I'd read all of them. I said yes. He thought about that for a moment, asked if they were good. I said some of them were. He asked if they'd helped. I thought about it for a second, said yes, they had, just not the way she planned. He sat with that for a second, then said that sounded about right. He asked if I was going to see anyone else. I said not for a while, probably. He nodded at that, like it made sense. We talked about other things after that, his work, a project he had coming up, nothing heavy. It was a good morning, actually. I've moved apartments since then, different part of the city. Still the same job, still see Reese. I'm doing okay in the way that's actually okay and not the deflecting version. Cleo has a big exhibition coming up. Mutual acquaintances have mentioned it. She's doing fine. I don't think about the list very much anymore. When I do, it's more like looking back at a solved problem than anything else. The irony of the whole thing is that I actually learned things from those books. Genuinely. The research was real, and some of it was useful, and I'd recommend a couple of them to anyone who was curious. I just also applied it honestly, rather than selectively. Apparently, that's the part nobody had factored in. That's the thing about giving a researcher a reading list. They don't read it the way you want them to. They read it the way the text is actually written. She gave me a set of tools and assumed she already knew what I'd build with them. I used the tools and found something she hadn't expected to be there. That's what happens when you give a reading list to someone whose job is reading. They read it,